Okay. So many speeches and comments. I won't be able to, or have no wish to, respond to them all. One thing for Councillor Burgess, Joyce, to quote one of your heroines, Margaret Thatcher, if they attack one personally, it means they've not a single political argument left. And you embarrassed yourself tonight, quite frankly. I'll just leave that one there, really. Okay. I won't comment on that either. Okay, so I'm grateful to Councillor Kelly and Councillor Cleary and Councillor Gilchrist for pointing out that the Conservatives, I would like to say well done all for sharing the same speech. It's basically just a list of numbers with no context to it. So as was highlighted, the Community Bank 5 million was set aside for the Community Bank and not spent. So I think it's incumbent on you to actually represent the facts with full context rather than just plucking figures out of the air. If we had one iota of what this Conservative government have wasted in contracts to their mates or written off in fraudulent payments, we would not be in this position. Sorry, I didn't heckle you, Tom. I didn't heckle you, Tom. Okay. We would not be in this position. I've got a figure here which I hope is slightly more useful than some of the rather arbitrary ones that's been plucked out tonight. Okay? Out of the 50 most deprived councils who've suffered the biggest cuts, only 6 of those have been Conservative and 28 have been Labour. So there's no disputing that Labour councils are being hammered by this government. And this is why we are here tonight. This is just not an easy thing for anyone to do, and I have listened really carefully to what colleagues have said. Phil, I know you've got concerns about Bidston and Brackenwood, and I would like to ask tonight that when the consultation is over and the appropriate committee has its first meeting, that any business cases that come through the consultation are looked at as a matter of urgency. I'm really heartened that we're having some positive dialogue with the Lawn Tennis Association, and I would hope that they do at some point continue talking to us over that. Similarly, I know we've had a few approaches around Brackenwood. Again, I would like to see that developed and quickly. Pat, I know what you're saying about climate emergency, but I think you're being really disingenuous to Labour Group in some of your comments. So I don't accept what you said, and we have restored the budget to its full amount. I'm just going to close, Mr Mayor, by saying this. This isn't easy. This is something we had to do. Government looked at Wirral and criticised us on a number of levels, and nobody in this room can sit here and say we're free of blame. But we were told that we had to work on a cross-party basis, and I think in the main we have. I think we've implemented most of the recommendations that were passed down to us. Not an easy thing to do, and I certainly haven't found this something I ever want to repeat again. We need to get through this budget. We need to prove to government, despite the fact that they've starved us of money for so long, that we will get on an even keel, and we will move forward next year, and we will start to grow this borough, and we will not let the government's treatment of local councils diminish our aspirations for our residents and for this borough. Thank you.
Okay, you'll be pleased to hear that is the end of that. Now I'd like to invite Chair Harewood to make any final comments as the Section 151 officer.
Thank you, Mayor. All of the proposals that have been received tonight as part of the amendments are legal and deliverable as a budget for next year.
That concludes the debate, members, and we will now move to the votes. So we start with the first vote is Joe Bird's amendments. This will be a recorded vote. I now invite Vicky to read out the names.
Members, as the Mayor has said, this will be a recorded vote, and all the votes relating to the budget and the setting of the council tax this evening will be recorded votes. So when I read out your name, I'd be grateful if you could please turn on your microphone.
Mr. Mayor, just as I pointed out, I apologise for interrupting the bush lister, but there appears to be 2 amendments in the name of Joe Bennett and 2 separate amendments in the, I think it was, Steve, and 2 amendments which I assume to be separate in the names of members of the Green Party. My assumption was, I might be entirely wrong, that there will be separate votes on those amendments. So when you're calling for a vote on Councillor Baird's amendment, I'm puzzled as to which one I'm being asked to vote on.
Councillor Kelly, I'll try to make it very clear in relation to each vote what you're being asked to vote upon. So as I was saying, when I read out your name, if members would be grateful enough to turn on their microphones and then to state whether they're voting for, against or abstaining. So the first recorded vote this evening will be in relation to the first of Councillor Bird's amendments. That's the amendment that relates to Europa pools, which is on page 28 of your supplementary pack. So this is Councillor Bird's amendment just in relation to Europa pools. So Councillor Anderson?
Against.
Councillor Berry?
Against.
Councillor Bird? For. Councillor Booth?
Against.
Councillor Brain?
Against.
Councillor Brennan? Against. Councillor Burgess-Joyce?
Against.
Councillor Cameron?
Against.
Councillor Camphor?
Against.
Councillor Cannon?
Against.
Councillor Cleary?
For.
Councillor Clements?
Against.
Councillor Collins?
Against.
Councillor Collinson?
Against.
Councillor Cook?
For.
Councillor Cottier?
Against.
Councillor Cox?
Against.
Councillor Davis?
Against.
Councillor Fowkes?
Against.
Councillor Frost?
Against.
Councillor Gardner?
Against.
Councillor Gilchrist?
Against?
Councillor Gleaves?
For.
Councillor Gorman?
For.
Councillor Greenie?
Against.
Councillor Green?
Against?
Councillor Gray?
Against.
Councillor Paul Hayes?
Against.
Councillor Stephen Hayes?
Against.
Councillor Andrew Hodson?
Against.
Councillor Kathy Hodson?
Against.
Councillor Johnson?
Against.
Councillor Adrian Jones?
Against.
Councillor Chris Jones?
Against.
Councillor Tony Jones? Councillor Jordan?
Against.
Councillor Kelly?
Against.
Councillor Brian Kenny?
Against.
Councillor Daisy Kenny?
Against.
Councillor Lewis?
Against.
Councillor Martin?
Against.
Councillor McLaughlin?
Against.
Councillor McManus?
Against.
Councillor Mitchell?
Against.
Councillor Mountney?
Against.
Councillor Nolan?
Against.
Councillor O'Hagan?
Against.
Councillor Osenloo?
Against.
Councillor Povell?
Against.
Councillor Rennie?
Against.
Councillor Robinson?
Against.
Councillor Rowlands?
Against.
Councillor Smith? Councillor Stewart?
Against.
Councillor Jason Walsh?
For.
Councillor Joe Walsh?
Against.
Councillor Whittingham?
Against.
Councillor Irene Williams?
Against.
Councillor Jerry Williams?
Against.
Councillor Steve Williams?
Against.
Councillor Williamson?
Against.
Councillor Wood?
Against.
And Councillor Wright?
Against.
If I missed anybody? No. Thank you. Members, that amendment was lost. There were 57 votes against and 6 votes in favour. If we could now move on to the vote in relation to the second of Councillor Bird's amendments. This relates to libraries and is at page 29 of your additional pack. So Councillor Anderson,
Against.
Councillor Berry,
Against.
Councillor Bird, for Councillor Booth,
Against.
Councillor Bray,
Against.
Councillor Brennan,
Against.
Councillor Burgess-Joyce,
Against.
Councillor Cameron,
Against.
Councillor Camphor,
Against.
Councillor Cannon,
Against.
Councillor Cleary,
For.
Councillor Clements,
Against.
Councillor Collins,
Against.
Councillor Collinson,
Against.
Councillor Cook,
For.
Councillor Cottier,
Against.
Councillor Cox,
Against.
Councillor Davis,
Against.
Councillor Fowkes,
Against.
Councillor Frost,
Against.
Councillor Gardner,
Against.
Councillor Gilchrist,
Against.
Councillor Gleaves,
For.
Councillor Gorman,
For.
Councillor Greenie,
For.
Councillor Green,
Against.
Councillor Gray,
Against.
Councillor Paul Hayes,
Against.
Councillor Stephen Hayes,
Against.
Councillor Andrew Hodson,
Against.
Councillor Kathy Hodson,
Against.
Councillor Johnson,
Against.
Councillor Adrian Jones,
Against.
Councillor Chris Jones,
Against.
Councillor Tony Jones, Councillor Jordan,
Against.
Councillor Kelly,
Against.
Councillor Brian Kenny,
Against.
Councillor Daisy Kenny,
Against.
Councillor Lewis,
Against.
Councillor Martin,
Against.
Councillor McLaughlin,
Against.
Councillor McManus,
Against.
Councillor Mitchell,
Against.
Councillor Mountney,
Against.
Councillor Nolan,
Against.
Councillor O'Hagan,
Against.
Councillor Osenloo,
Against.
Councillor Povell,
Against.
Councillor Rennie,
Against.
Councillor Robinson,
Against.
Councillor Rowlands,
Against.
Councillor Smith, Councillor Stewart,
Against.
Councillor Jason Walsh,
For.
Councillor Joe Walsh,
Against.
Councillor Whittingham,
Against.
Councillor Irene Williams,
Against.
Councillor Jerry Williams,
Against.
Councillor Steve Williams,
Against.
Councillor Williamson,
Against.
Councillor Wood, and Councillor Wright.
Against.
Thank you, members. Thank you, members. That amendment was also lost. There were 7 votes in favour and 56 votes against. The next vote, members, relates to the Green Group amendments, and again there are 2 amendments that have been moved here. So the first vote will be in relation to the Green Group amendments that are on page 4 and 5 of the supplementary pack. Those are the amendments that don't include the proposal in relation to individual ward member budgets. So Councillor Anderson,
Against.
Councillor Berry,
Against.
Councillor Bird,
For.
Councillor Booth,
Against.
Councillor Bray,
For.
Councillor Brennan, Councillor Burgess-Joyce.
Against.
Councillor Cameron.
Against.
Councillor Camphor.
Against.
Councillor Cannon.
Against.
Councillor Cleary.
For.
Councillor Clements.
Against.
Councillor Collins.
Against.
Councillor Collinson.
Against.
Councillor Cook.
For.
Councillor Cottier.
Against.
Councillor Cox.
Against.
Councillor Davis.
Against.
Councillor Fowkes.
Against.
Councillor Frost.
Against.
Councillor Gardner.
Against.
Councillor Gilchrist.
For.
Councillor Gleaves. For. Councillor Gorman.
For.
Councillor Greenie.
Against.
Councillor Green.
Against.
Councillor Gray.
Against.
Councillor Paul Hayes.
Against.
Councillor Stephen Hayes.
Against.
Councillor Andrew Hodson.
Against.
Councillor Kathy Hodson.
Against.
Councillor Johnson. Against. Councillor Adrian Jones.
Against.
Councillor Chris Jones.
Against.
Councillor Tony Jones. Councillor Jordan.
Against.
Councillor Kelly.
For.
Councillor Brian Kenny.
Against.
Councillor Daisy Kenny.
Against.
Councillor Lewis.
Against.
Councillor Martin.
Against.
Councillor McLaughlin.
Against.
Councillor McManus.
Against.
Councillor Mitchell.
For.
Councillor Mountney. Councillor Nolan.
Against.
Councillor O'Hagan.
Against.
Councillor Osenloo.
For.
Councillor Povell.
Against.
Councillor Rennie.
Against.
Councillor Robinson.
Against.
Councillor Rowlands.
Against.
Councillor Smith. Councillor Stewart.
Against.
Councillor Jason Walsh.
For.
Councillor Joe Walsh.
Against.
Councillor Whittingham.
Against.
Councillor Irene Williams.
Against.
Councillor Jerry Williams.
Against.
Councillor Steve Williams.
Against.
Councillor Williamson.
Against.
Councillor Wood. And Councillor Wright.
Against.
Thank you, members. Members, that amendment was lost. There were 11 votes in favour and 52 votes against. So we now move on to the second of the Green Group amendments. This is as set out on page 6 of the supplementary agenda pack and is specifically on the removal of individual member budgets, and the proposal is that the saving be increased to 250k so as to make sufficient monies available to enable the climate emergency budget for 22-23 to be increased by £66,000. So Councillor Anderson.
Against.
Councillor Berry.
Against.
Councillor Bird.
For.
Councillor Booth. Councillor Brain.
Against.
Councillor Brennan.
Against.
Councillor Burgess-Joyce.
Against.
Councillor Cameron.
Against.
Councillor Camphor.
Against.
Councillor Cannon.
Against.
Councillor Cleary.
For.
Councillor Clements.
Against.
Councillor Collins.
Against.
Councillor Collinson.
Against.
Councillor Cook.
For.
Councillor Cottier.
Against.
Councillor Cox.
Against.
Councillor Davis.
Against.
Councillor Fowkes.
Against.
Councillor Frost.
Against.
Councillor Gardner.
Against.
Councillor Gilchrist.
Against.
Councillor Gleaves. For. Councillor Gorman.
For.
Councillor Greenie.
Against.
Councillor Green.
Against.
Councillor Gray.
Against.
Councillor Paul Hayes.
Against.
Councillor Stephen Hayes.
Against.
Councillor Andrew Hodson.
Against.
Councillor Cathy Hodson.
Against.
Councillor Johnson.
Against.
Councillor Adrian Jones.
Against.
Councillor Chris Jones.
Against.
Councillor Tony Jones. Councillor Jordan.
Against.
Councillor Kelly.
Against.
Councillor Brian Kenny.
Against.
Councillor Daisy Kenny.
Against.
Councillor Lewis.
Against.
Councillor Martin.
Against.
Councillor McLaughlin.
Against.
Councillor McManus.
Against.
Councillor Mitchell.
Against.
Councillor Mountney.
Against.
Councillor Nolan.
Against.
Councillor O'Hagan.
Against.
Councillor Ozenloo.
Against.
Councillor Povell.
Against.
Councillor Rennie.
Against.
Councillor Robinson.
Against.
Councillor Rowlands.
Against.
Councillor Smith. Councillor Stewart.
Against.
Councillor Jason Walsh.
For.
Councillor Joe Walsh.
Against.
Councillor Whittingham.
Against.
Councillor Irene Williams.
Against.
Councillor Jerry Williams.
Against.
Councillor Steve Williams.
Against.
Councillor Williamson.
Against.
Councillor Wood. And Councillor Wright. Your members. Thank you, members. That amendment was lost. Votes in favour were 6, votes against 57. So that now takes us on to the Liberal Democrat amendment. And again, recorded vote in relation to this amendment. So Councillor Anderson.
Against.
Councillor Berry.
Against.
Councillor Bird.
For.
Councillor Booth.
Against.
Councillor Brain.
For.
Councillor Brennan. Councillor Burgess-Joyce.
Against.
Councillor Cameron.
Against.
Councillor Camphor.
Against.
Councillor Canham.
Against.
Councillor Cleary.
For.
Councillor Clements.
Against.
Councillor Collins.
Against.
Councillor Collinson.
Against.
Councillor Cook.
For.
Councillor Cottier.
Against.
Councillor Cox.
Against.
Councillor Davis.
Against.
Councillor Fowkes.
Against.
Councillor Frost.
Against.
Councillor Gardner.
Against.
Councillor Gilchrist.
For.
Councillor Gleaves.
For.
Councillor Gorman.
For.
Councillor Green. Councillor Green.
Against.
Councillor Gray.
Against.
Councillor Paul Hayes.
Against.
Councillor Stephen Hayes.
For.
Councillor Andrew Hodson.
Against.
Councillor Cathy Hodson.
Against.
Councillor Johnson.
Against.
Councillor Adrian Jones.
Against.
Councillor Chris Jones.
Against.
Councillor Tony Jones. Councillor Jordan.
Against.
Councillor Kelly.
For.
Councillor Brian Kenny.
Against.
Councillor Daisy Kenny.
Against.
Councillor Lewis.
Against.
Councillor Martin.
Against.
Councillor McLaughlin.
For.
Councillor McManus.
Against.
Councillor Mitchell.
For.
Councillor Mountney.
Against.
Councillor Nolan.
Against.
Councillor O'Hagan.
Against.
Councillor Ozenloo.
For.
Councillor Povell.
Against.
Councillor Rennie.
Against.
Councillor Robinson.
Against.
Councillor Rowlands.
Against.
Councillor Smith. Councillor Stewart.
Against.
Councillor Jason Walsh.
For.
Councillor Joe Walsh.
Against.
Councillor Whittingham.
Against.
Councillor Irene Williams. Councillor Jerry Williams. Councillor Steve Williams.
Against.
Councillor Williamson.
Against.
Councillor Wood. Councillor Wright.
Against.
Thank you, members. Members, that amendment was lost. The votes in favour were 14 and the votes against 49. So that now takes us on, that completes now the voting on the amendments, and it takes us to the substantive motion as moved by Councillor Williamson with her alteration. And again, it's a recorded vote. So Councillor Anderson.
For.
Councillor Berry.
For.
Councillor Bird.
Against.
Councillor Booth.
For.
Councillor Brame.
Against.
Councillor Brennan.
For.
Councillor Burgess-Joyce.
For.
Councillor Cameron.
For.
Councillor Camphor.
For.
Councillor Cannon.
For.
Councillor Cleary.
Against.
Councillor Clements.
For.
Councillor Collins.
For.
Councillor Collinson.
For.
Councillor Cook.
Against.
Councillor Cottier.
For.
Councillor Cox.
For.
Councillor Davis.
For.
Councillor Fawkes.
For.
Councillor Frost. For. Councillor Gardner.
For.
Councillor Gilchrist.
Against.
Councillor Gleaves.
Against.
Councillor Gorman.
Against.
Councillor Greenie.
For.
Councillor Green.
For.
Councillor Gray. Councillor Paul Hayes.
For.
Councillor Stephen Hayes.
For.
Councillor Andrew Hodson.
For.
Councillor Kathy Hodson.
For.
Councillor Johnson. For. Councillor Adrian Jones.
For.
Councillor Chris Jones.
For.
Councillor Tony Jones.
For.
Councillor Jordan.
For.
Councillor Kelly.
Against.
Councillor Brian Kenny.
For.
Councillor Daisy Kenny.
For.
Councillor Lewis.
For.
Councillor Martin.
For.
Councillor McLaughlin.
For.
Councillor McManus.
For.
Councillor Mitchell. Councillor Mountney.
For.
Councillor Nolan.
For.
Councillor O'Hagan.
For.
Councillor Osenloo.
Against.
Councillor Povell.
For.
Councillor Rennie. For. Councillor Robinson.
For.
Councillor Rowlands.
For.
Councillor Smith. Councillor Stewart.
For.
Councillor Jason Walsh.
Against.
Councillor Joe Walsh.
For.
Councillor Whittingham.
For.
Councillor Irene Williams.
For.
Councillor Jerry Williams.
For.
Councillor Steve Williams.
For.
Councillor Williamson.
For.
Councillor Wood. And Councillor Wright.
For.
Thank you, members. Members.
Mr Mayor, point of order, can I just clarify what I've just witnessed? We've actually seen a situation where serious politicians voted not to set a legal budget. Is that what I've witnessed? Confirmation?
Members, the outcome of that vote is that it was carried. The votes in favour were 52 and the votes against were 11. So that takes us on to the final recorded vote this evening, and this vote is in respect to the statutory calculations for the council tax precept as detailed in the summons, and which require approval by council for the year 22-23 in accordance with section 32 to 36 of the Local Government Finance Act 1992. So, Councillor Anderson.
For.
Councillor Berry.
For.
Councillor Bird.
Four.
Councillor Booth.
For.
Councillor Brain.
For.
Councillor Brennan. Councillor Burgess-Joyce.
For.
Councillor Cameron.
For.
Councillor Camphor.
For.
Councillor Cannon.
Four.
Councillor Cleary.
For.
Councillor Clements.
4.
Councillor Collins.
For.
Councillor Collinson.
Four.
Councillor Cook.
For.
Councillor Cottier.
For.
Councillor Cox.
For.
Councillor Davis. Councillor Fowkes.
For.
Councillor Frost.
Four.
Councillor Gardner.
For.
Councillor Gilchrist.
For.
Councillor Gleaves. Councillor Gorman.
For.
Councillor Greenie.
For.
Councillor Green.
For.
Councillor Gray. Councillor Paul Hayes.
For.
Councillor Stephen Hayes.
For.
Councillor Andrew Hodson. Councillor Kathy Hodson.
4.
Councillor Johnson. 4. Councillor Adrian Jones.
For.
Councillor Chris Jones.
4.
Councillor Tony Jones. Councillor Jordan.
4.
Councillor Kelly.
For.
Councillor Brian Kenny.
For.
Councillor Daisy Kenny. 4. Councillor Lewis.
For.
Councillor Martin.
4.
Councillor McLaughlin.
4.
Councillor McManus.
4.
Councillor Mitchell.
4.
Councillor Mountney.
4.
Councillor Nolan.
4.
Councillor O'Hagan.
4.
Councillor Osenloo.
4.
Councillor Poble.
4.
Councillor Rennie. 4. Councillor Robinson.
4.
Councillor Rowlands.
4.
Councillor Smith.
4.
Councillor Stewart.
4.
Councillor Jason Walsh.
4.
Councillor Joe Walsh.
4.
Councillor Whittingham.
4.
Councillor Irene Williams.
4.
Councillor Jerry Williams.
4.
Councillor Steve Williams.
4.
Councillor Williamson.
4.
Councillor Wood. And Councillor Wright. Thank you, members. Thank you, members. That matter was carried. There were 63 votes in favour, none against and no abstentions.
Right, we've just got to complete the rest of the things. I'm going to do it just by a straightforward show of hands, if you don't mind. So the first one is Capital Programme 2021 to 26. All those in favour? Opposed and seconded?
So moved.
Dean. Opposed and seconded?
So moved.
Seconded. Right. Come on. All those in favour, please show. Against? Abstentions? Right, let's get the next one. That was D, wasn't it? The Capital Finance Strategy 2022-23.
So moved, Mr. Mayor.
Intent
Seconded,
stated.
Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. Right, so we've got a proposal to seconder, and all those in favour, please show. Against? Abstentions? No? Only? Next one, where's the next one? It's this one here. Right. Right, the next one is External Auditor Appointment 2023-24 to 27 to 29.
So moved, Mr Mayor.
Seconder? Yvonne.
Seconded, Mr Mayor.
Thank you. All those in favour? Against? No. And abstentions? No. And so that concludes tonight's meeting. Can I just say, first of all, thank you. It's been a long evening, I understand that, and a big thank you to the members of the public for being patient and listening to the debate as you go along, and to members who were good to each other, I think is the word I'm looking. So thank you very much indeed, and I declare the meeting closed. Thank you.